of Clopcast. You're back here with Jordan. Today is going to be all about the skeleton of the horse. So I'm talking about just the bones today. I'm going to address a little bit about the maturation of bones towards the end and kind of just go into my thoughts around when I start horses and that kind of stuff. But this is going to be a Pony Club friendly podcast. So this is going to go into the actual bones of the horse. So if you are a Pony Club leader or instructor and you need a little bit of supplemental help on the actual bones of a horse, this will be a great podcast to reference, okay? So let's start out with just the actual skull of the horse. So these are actually very similar to the bones that are in a human head. So you start out with the occipital bone, which is right in between the horse's ears. The parietal bone is right in front of the horse's eyes, where that would be. Then you come to the frontal bone, which is where the actual eye socket is located around. That's where the frontal bone is in the skull. Next up, you have the nasal bone, which all of us know as the long straight line that leads to the horse's actual nasal passage and the nasal openings. Then you run into things like the lacrimal bone, which is actually right beside the nasal bone. And that is where the nose sinus passages go through. Then you have the zygomatic bone, which is the actual cheek. The cheekbone, the point of the face, is what you're looking at there for the zygomatic bone. Then you have the maxillary, which is where the horse's front teeth are. So that is the maxillary bone is what comes down and actually houses those front incisor teeth. Then you have the lower jaw, which is called the mandible. So it is important to learn about the different bones in the horse's face because you have to understand how a bridle fits a horse. And that's something I will address in a later podcast, but you have to understand where these bones are, as every horse's face is just a little bit different. So once you're trying to figure out how your horse's bridle fits, if you kind of know where all of these bones lay, you understand how to avoid actually hurting your horse's face and putting pressure points on sensitive nerves. If you know where all these bones are, you can kind of eventually figure out where all of the nerves are and that kind of layout. So after you get past the horse's head, this is where we get into some of the interesting stuff. So those of us that are focused in disciplines where we want the horse to be supple, which is just about every discipline, you need a supple horse, a soft horse that's willing to move and bend through the neck and that kind of stuff. So that actually all originates based off of the first two bones in the horse's actual neck. So there are 7 bones in your horse's neck, and those first 2 bones are called the atlas, which actually connects to the horse's skull, and the axis. Yes, the atlas and the axis. So what that is the atlas and the axis, the way they connect kind of acts as a pivot. So when your horse is bending through the neck, they actually have to flex through their atlas and their axis. You want them to move through that, but they also have to continue moving. A lot of horses will cheat and just twist at their atlas and kind of make that bend, and then the rest of the neck isn't truly bending. But when you get that true curvature through the whole of the other 5 bones in the neck, then you achieve a true bend in the neck. After that, I'm going to continue down the spine for now. After your 7 cervical, which is the bones in the actual neck, that's the cervical bones of the spine, you come to what is called the thoracic. So this is actually where your saddle will sit and where your saddle pads go, and this is the bones that hold the rib cage, and these bones actually make up the wither. So the way these work is there's typically 18 of them, and they connect to 18 pairs of rib cages. For those of you who have Arabians, typically Arabians actually have 17 pairs of ribs. And the way that works out is they just connect to the thoracic, and that's what houses all of your organs that are in your horse. There's the big area that the lungs sit in as well. Now, you want your saddle to actually sit on the thoracic bones. If you get into the next set of bones in the spine, you know your saddle is actually sitting a little too far back. Coming up in my next podcast, hopefully I will actually have some interviews with a actual saddle fitter for custom saddlery, and he's going to go into a little bit about how a saddle should actually sit on your horse. So stay tuned for that. So like I said, we're going to the lumbar region of the horse. So this is where the horse's kidneys are housed, and this is what is transitioning the horse's spine from where the organs are to the actual pelvis of the horse. The lumbar continues on into the sacral, which is 5 bones that are actually fused. So it's kind of similar to the human tailbone, where our spine keeps going but fuses into our little tailbone. That's why it's possible to break your tailbone, but you actually have fused bones there. After your sacral, you run into what is called the caudal bones, which are basically the bones that make up the tail. That's what gives them that solid bone at the base of the sacral, where their tail comes out and they're able to swish it around. Those are the caudal bones. Now, horses can have anywhere from 15 to 25 of these. That's why you have some horses with a longer tail, some horses with a shorter tail. The average is generally around 18, so that's a good number to go with. Always reference your Pony Club handbook to double check and make sure what numbers you actually need for your Pony Club ratings. Now, I think I forgot to mention it, but just a heads up, the lumbar of the horse has regularly 6 bones. And then those of you that have Arabians, you're going to have 5 bones typically. Arabians are built slightly smaller than all other what is called warm blood breeds and cold blood breeds. So they actually ended up losing, or I should say evolving out of having one extra set of rib cages and that one extra lumbar. So don't worry, I just got done with all of the boring stuff. Now I'm going to get into more of the interesting stuff that I have to talk about, and that is your horse's legs. So you want to really understand your horse's legs in order to increase and improve the longevity of your horse. And the more you understand about the legs, the better you're going to be able to take care of your horse, because your horse carries 60% of its weight on its front legs. That's why we see so many injuries on the front legs of a horse. They carry the rest of the weight, the 40% on the hind legs. That's why when you're doing dressage or reining or hunters or anything and you want your horse to travel what is called uphill, you want them to lighten that load on the front legs and put it on the hind legs so that you're lightening that load on those front bones and not allowing those injuries to kind of perpetuate. So I'm going to tell you something really interesting. A lot of people seem to maybe don't understand quite how the horse's limbs work. I watched a actual dissection of a horse, an autopsy kind of thing, and they did this thing where they actually took a scalpel and you were able to physically lift the horse's front leg off of the rib cage because there's actually no socket holding your horse's front leg to its body. What that means is it's all muscle holding that leg on there, which is actually really cool. I'm going to go into how that works in another episode, the biomechanics of how that works. So the bone that's actually right there up by the thoracic is just like your horse has a scapula. And like I said, it's not actually attached to the spine. It's actually attached by a lot of muscle. That's why your horses have such a big chest and such a big shoulder. There's so much muscle fibers holding that leg on there and putting it together. It's insane how it actually works. Once you get past your scapula, just like you kind of get onto your humerus bone, which is like where you hit your elbow, kind of. That's that big bone right there. In between your scapula and your humerus is your scapulohumeral joint. What that means is that's the little ball, kind of like a ball and socket joint, very similar to us. Horses is more of a straight up and down motion. If a horse had a ball and socket joint like we do, imagine how much motion that leg would have. It'd be kind of terrifying to ride a horse with that much motion in their front leg. After you get past the humerus, you're now down to what people would normally think of as your horse's elbow, which is actually pretty close to what your elbow is. That's kind of where yours is as well. But when you continue down, whereas we have two bones in our arm, our forearm. They have actually one. And what has happened is um, the horse's ulna, which is what stabilizes, has fused to the horse's radius. So that has stopped the rotation in that leg. Can you imagine watching a racehorse go full speed and the leg rotate? That would be absolutely terrifying. Once you get past that, you get down into the carpal bones, which turns into your wrist. And then that's where things get a little weird between horses and people. Horses technically walk on what is their fingertips. So once you get past the carpal bones, you get into the splint bones and the cannon bones. And then after the cannon bone is that long bone right above, that really long, thick bone above the hoof. It's kind of hard to obviously describe this when you don't have something to look at. So I highly suggest looking at a quick skeleton of a horse when you get done with this podcast, just to kind of get yourself equated and understand where all of this stuff is. You have the splint bones on either side of the cannon bone holding up the carpal bones. Then the cannon bone, right at the back of the cannon bone, is two little bones called the proximal sesamoid bones. So these are what holds up your horse's suspensories. The suspensory mechanism that actually holds your horse's fetlock up into the air. Once you figure out where that is, then you have your long pastern and your short pastern, which are pretty easy to find. Your long pastern is the little skinny section that actually leads down to the hoof. And then inside the hoof is more of the short pastern and what is called the coffin bone. If you are learning anything about your horse's feet, you need to understand that that is the coffin bone that is actually in that hoof, and that is what makes the hoof is what actually pushes in the hoof to actually send blood flow up and down the leg. I'll get a little bit more into the actual tendons and the actual inner workings of the front leg in another episode, of course, but I just wanted to give you guys a quick rundown of how that works. So the front leg is done. Next, we're on to the hind leg. So the hind leg, you get into the horse's pelvis is where you start, and now the pelvis is attached at the sacral bones. And then the sacral bones are fused, so that's where the pelvis comes up and into connection with the spine. The pelvis is made up of the ilium and the ischium, so that is two bones that have decided to fuse together through evolution. And when you get to that, they are what actually creates the sling and the area for the horse's hind legs. Just like you have your pelvis, that's what allows your legs to attach to your body. When you get past the ilium and the ischium, horses have very similar to us. They have their femur, but their femur is in proportion to where our femur is. It's a very different size. The femur is what actually comes down towards the horse's belly to create that odd arc in the back leg. Like I said, if you want to definitely take a look at a quick skeleton of a horse, it's great to accompany this podcast with a quick little peek at a skeleton of a horse, or even if you're at the barn and you're grooming your horse listening to this, take a look at your horse's body. Try and lay out where these bones are. Once you get past the femur, you are on to the patella. So the horse's patella is just like ours. It allows the legs to move up and down and slide back and forth without catching. Sometimes horses can actually have issues with their patella, and that will lead to other issues that you will see. That's why we call there's an issue with their stifle. It's generally something's wrong with their patella. So if you ever run into a horse that has an issue in their stifle, it's generally something in the patella or the joint surrounding that bone. Once you get past the patella, you move on to what is called the fibula and the tibia. Fibula and tibia. So much like the front legs, the ulna and the radius, these two have fused again to allow the horse's leg to be a little bit more stabilized. This was, once again, all through evolution. That's how this developed. Next part is your horse's hock. So if anyone has purchased a horse in the past, they know that the vets generally do a hock flexion test. So this is testing all of the joints and all of the tendons that surround these bones. There are so many bones that actually make up the hock. And I'm not going to go super in depth into the hock, but I'm going to mention just some of the bones because they get kind of interesting. So the hock is actually called the tarsal joint. Tarsals are the back legs, and this is called the tarsal joint. And you actually have 6 bones, 5 actual individual joints within this actual, what we call the hock. You start out with what is called the calcaneus. So if anyone has ever looked at a horse's hock, there's a point at the back, and that is, once again, that's the calcaneus. So that is what actually makes that point of the hock come out. That helps with stabilizing from the back and doesn't allow the leg to rotate too far backwards. Next part is the talus, and that is what actually allows for the rotation of the hock. That's what actually allows for all of the flexion that we're always trying to achieve in a horse. Then you run into the other tarsal bones. There's the central, 3, 1, 2, and 4. That's kind of a weird way to say them, but that's kind of how they fall in the horse's hock. 1 and 2 have eventually fused at this point in the horse's evolution, and that's what actually makes up the different layers of the tarsal joint. When you get into the back legs, you still have your cannon and the proximal sesamoid bones, the long and short pastern, and the coffin bone. I wanted to add in a fun little tidbit. So your horse's back legs are called the metatarsals, just like your feet. For those of you who haven't taken anatomy yet or learned the bones of the body, the metatarsals are very similar to your toes. Those are the exact same bones that are in your toes. That's what makes up your horse's lower leg. Your horse's front legs are made up of the metacarpals, so that's kind of what makes up your wrist and the palm of your hand. That's kind of your metatarsals. When you get past those, the metacarpals are what are in your hand. Metacarpals. The next part is when you get to the horse's actual long and short pastern, those actually have different names. So those are actually called basically what is your phalanges, the phalanx. And so you have first phalanx, which is the longest one, second phalanx, which is the short one, and then the third, which is your coffin bone. And those have what are called layman's terms. That's when you run into the cannon bone, the long and short pastern, and the coffin bone. Those are your non-scientific names for these things. So that's just a little, really quick run through of the horse's skeleton. I have been sick the whole weekend, so I'm trying to get this in between cough drops. So I just also wanted to touch on why it is important to understand the skeleton of your horse. So we study the human body, right? We try and find there's a certain conformation in humans for certain sports. There are outliers, of course, but generally, basically all basketball players kind of look similar, and all linemen in football kind of look similar. You kind of understand that certain body types lend to be certain athletic abilities. Same thing with horses. So if you can understand the skeleton that's actually underneath all of that muscle and see what the actual structure of your horse is, you're going to be able to make a better educated decision on what discipline is right for you and your horse. It is also important because you will also be able to explain any issues to your vet. So say your horse gets a scratch, you can say, you don't have to say my horse got a cut on its lower leg. You can say my horse got a cut on about halfway up its cannon bone. My horse has a little swollen lump over its scapula, and this can be very helpful for your vet to come out and kind of have a game plan ahead of time as to what they're going to do to help your horse. Now, I wanted to just address a little bit about there's such a huge debate in when you should start horses. Now, I'm probably going to step on some toes, and I'm not going to feel bad about it because I grew up riding several different disciplines. So I met people that would start horses at 2 years old. I met people that would start horses at 18 months old. I've met people that wouldn't start a horse until they were 6 years old. So there is such a huge difference in the opinions on when horses should be started. Now, me, I will explain this in the way I kind of think about it. I look at each horse as an individual. Now, when I'm starting horses, do I start them hard, young? No, I don't do that. That is something I am actually quite against. And when I was experiencing it as a, maybe not as an assistant, but in different learning situations, I was not very happy with it. And so, I personally, when I got my first horse that I wanted to start, I did actually initially back her at about 2 years old. So that's kind of when she was showing me that she was mentally mature enough to kind of start learning a little bit more. And she'd already learned to take a saddle on her back, learned how to long line, and she was doing great with all of these different things. So I decided, fine, I'm going to put you on a lead rope and I'm going to just swing on your back, and my mom's going to walk you around for a little bit. That was our first ride. She was 2 years old. Almost to the day she was 2 years old at that point. Now, after that, I probably rode her maybe 5 more times over the next month. Now, that's 5 rides in 30 days, so that's next to nothing. I barely walked her around. I got her to the point where I could walk her and maybe trot a few steps on a straight line before I decided, all right, it's time for you to go back into the pasture and you're going to grow up a little bit more, and then we're going to revisit this in the springtime. She matured and became a totally different totally different musculature, and she developed differently. So when spring rolled around, I looked at her again and said, all right, looks like you're able to come with me to college. And I started riding her a little bit more consistently. I think I rode her maybe 2 days a week for the first month. And then the second month, I rode her 3 days a week. The other days of the week, we did groundwork and lots of training and that kind of stuff, just to keep her tuned up. And then we began cantering when she was 3 years old. So she showed me that she was relaxed enough at the walk and the trot and out on the trails that she was ready to go into the arena and do some canter work. At 3 years old, I decided to start doing that. Now, she was a quarter horse, so her body definitely matured very well. And I walked, trot, and cantered her, and that was it. I sold her as a 4-year-old, and I do believe only just recently, I do believe she's almost 6 now, did her owners start to jump her, and they made that decision for themselves. I probably would have started her very, very low at about 4.5, but that's just my opinion. Her body was maturing at a certain rate, and I had the vets check her. If anything seemed off, vets always came out and took a peek at her, and they all said, nope, she's great, keep going as you're going. So that's just how Millie was for me. Now, my horse Noodles, she was started obviously at the racetrack, and she was probably closer to 18 months when she was started, and she was started for racing. So they usually go a little bit harder, a little earlier. So I really didn't have that choice in that matter, which kind of stinks, but that's part of the reality of it. I had to get over it. And unfortunately, at her age, she is only 10 this year. She's going to be 10, and she's already unfortunately retired. So I do believe that if I had looked at her, I would say, she does not need to be started if this was my horse. Racetracks are different, so I can't really speak to that because I don't know the experience in that kind of field. But I do also firmly believe that a horse's body, much like a kid, matures more when they are under stress. Not necessarily hard stress, but you wouldn't put your kid in a closet and then expect them to go out 1 hour a day and play football. They'd get injured, right? So that's kind of my thought process on it. And I have read lots of articles that are that kind of go towards starting horses and starting them with moderate to heavy work. Fewer days a week is what showed to be really successful. It's the horses that actually had moderate to light work multiple days a week, like 5 days a week, are the horses that actually showed deterioration, whereas the horses that had short bursts of hard work, fewer days a week, actually showed bone density development and very minimal deterioration, which is, obviously you don't want to see any deterioration, but those were what the article is all said. These were tests done by, I do believe, the Kentucky Research Institute for horse racing, if that's what it's called. I will double check that and put a link in the description for you guys to go and take a look at. But this was done in the late 90s by a doctor named David Noonamaker. I probably just butchered your name, so I am so sorry. But this is what provided that moderate exercise did not improve bone density, but light to moderate did not improve bone density, but moderate to heavy did. And this kind of really showed me that it's okay to start your horses at a younger age as long as you do it in moderation and are very careful with what you do. You obviously don't want to be jumping a 2-year-old right off the bat. That's just not a good idea. Even when I was riding and I was an assistant, I know we had a 6-year-old who, when I was riding him for probably 6 months in his development, we wouldn't sit the trot on him. And this was because even at 6, his back muscle was not developed enough for you to sit on his back. And that's where truly good riders learn to actually develop their horses instead of jump ahead. It's more like you're running a marathon when you're training a horse, especially in dressage. That's why you don't see many young horses competing at the really high levels, because they just simply haven't had the training necessary to compete at those levels. But I just want to touch base on that because I know my opinion is actually kind of interesting and not necessarily controversial, but I have a very laid back opinion on training horses. I think you should use your own discretion and just kind of work with your veterinarian. That's what I did, and I was very successful with the horses that I have started. None of them have shown, knock on some wood, I'm going to go ahead and do that, knock on wood. None of them have shown any issues such as deterioration, no signs of navicular damage, nothing like that would cause me to think I started them too young and started the damage too early, that kind of thing. I am an advocate for longevity of your horse, but I also do believe that horses are built for, they're very strong animals, so you have to kind of decide what you want to do with them. And if you want to do high levels with them, you want to have a horse that their body can hold up to it, and you have to figure out how the horse was started and how you want to, if you want to start your horse a certain way. That is completely up to you. Like I said, talk to your vet about that. I hope you guys really got a little bit out of this. I know this was a little bit more of a short episode, but like I said, I have been sick and I'm trying to go ahead and get something out for you guys so you guys can have something to enjoy. Coming up soon, I am going to have some interview questions with a saddle fitter regarding saddle fits. So if you can brush yourself up on the skeleton of the horse and understand what I'm talking about for the next episode, that would be awesome. Remember that we are available on all social media handles. So we have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and now we have a YouTube channel where all of the audio for these podcasts can be listened to on YouTube. That is all under Clopcast or Clopcast Podcast. If you have topic ideas, comments, suggestions, please send them in an email on over to clopcastpodcast@gmail.com. I want you guys to kiss lots of pony noses, and I will see you guys next time.